Operation Iceberg had commenced 3 days earlier when the first elements of the 10th Army began landing on the Kurama Islands, a preliminary operation designed to secure anchorages and eliminate Japanese suicide boat bases before the main assault on Okinawa proper. By the spring of 1945, the Pacific War had developed a momentum that felt simultaneously inevitable and apocalyptic. Island by island, the United States was grinding its way toward the Japanese home islands, each step purchased with blood and measured in casualty figures that would have seemed unimaginable 4 years earlier. Okinawa represented the final threshold, a populated island only 340 miles from Kyushu, large enough to serve as a staging ground for the invasion of Japan itself, and defended by approximately 110,000 Japanese troops who had been given explicit orders that surrender was not an option. The strategic calculus was brutally simple. American planners estimated that capturing Okinawa would require between 2 and 3 months of sustained combat operations and produce casualties potentially exceeding those of the entire Normandy campaign. The Japanese, for their part, had no illusions about holding the island indefinitely. Their strategy was attrition, to make the Americans pay such a terrible price for every ridge and village that the prospect of invading the home islands would become politically untenable. Every Japanese soldier on Okinawa understood that he was not expected to survive. The island had become a killing ground by design, a place where men would die not to win, but to make their enemy reconsider the mathematics of victory. The geography of Okinawa itself seemed designed for this kind of warfare. The island stretched approximately 60 miles from north to south and averaged less than 10 miles in width, its terrain a nightmare combination of limestone ridges, coral escarpments, and narrow valleys choked with vegetation. The southern portion of the island, where the main Japanese defensive positions had been constructed, featured natural fortifications that made the mountains of Italy look hospitable by comparison. The Japanese had spent months tunneling into the limestone, creating a subterranean fortress system with interconnected caves, hidden artillery positions, and supply depots carved deep enough to survive even the heaviest naval bombardment. Above ground, every ridge and draw had been pre-registered for artillery and mortar fire. Every approach covered by interlocking machine gun positions. Every village transformed into a strong point. But there was another element to Okinawa that did not appear on the military maps or in the intelligence briefings. The Ryukyu Islands had been inhabited for over 30,000 years, long before the Japanese Empire had annexed them in the 17th century. The indigenous people, the Uchinyanshu, maintained traditions and beliefs that predated Buddhism and Shinto, spiritual practices rooted in ancestor worship and a profound connection to the land itself. The islands were considered sacred ground, dotted with utaki, holy sites where the living world intersected with the realm of spirits. Stone shrines marked these locations, some dating back centuries, places where priestesses called Noro had once performed rituals to honor the dead and maintain the balance between the material and spiritual worlds. The elderly Okinawans who remained in the southern villages, those too old or stubborn to evacuate when the Japanese military had conscripted the able-bodied population, spoke in hushed tones about Majimun, the spirits and demons that inhabited certain places. They spoke specifically of the limestone caves, which the locals had traditionally avoided except during the most sacred ceremonies. The caves were thresholds, they said, places where the boundary between worlds grew thin. To disturb them was to invite the attention of things that should remain undisturbed. To fill them with soldiers and weapons and the machinery of war was to commit a transgression that would have consequences extending far beyond the merely tactical. The Japanese soldiers, most of them conscripts from the mainland with no connection to Ryukyu traditions, dismissed these warnings as primitive superstition. The American Marines and Army infantry, who would soon be landing on the beaches, had never heard them at all. Both sides prepared for battle with the rational tools of modern warfare, artillery tables and fire support coordinates, ammunition loads, and casualty projections. Neither side understood that they were about to fight on ground that had been sacred for 3,000 years, in caves that had served as burial sites and spirit gates since before recorded history, on an island where the accumulated dead of centuries lay so thickly beneath the soil that every shovel of earth turned up bones. Lieutenant James Harker of the 1st Marine Division, 5th Regiment, had been briefed on the tactical situation during the crossing from Ulithi Atoll. His platoon, 3rd Platoon K Company, consisted of 42 men, most of them veterans of Peleliu and Guadalcanal, men who had survived the island-hopping campaign and developed the fatalistic competence that came from watching friends die and continuing to function anyway. They knew the statistics. The Japanese would not surrender. Civilians would be caught in the crossfire or compelled to commit suicide by their own military. The fighting would be close range and brutal, a war of grenades and flamethrowers in confined spaces where artillery and air support meant nothing. They knew all of this, and they loaded their weapons and sharpened their combat knives and prepared to do it again. But Harker had noticed something during the final approach to the Kurama Islands, something he had not observed in previous operations. The water around the islands was an almost unnatural shade of turquoise, so clear that the coral formations on the seafloor were visible from the deck of the transport ship. Beautiful, in a way that seemed incongruous with what was about to occur. And, as the landing craft had approached the beaches on the morning of the 26th of March, he had seen something else, shadows beneath the water, moving parallel to the boats, keeping pace, too large to be fish, too deliberate in their movement to be natural. When he had pointed them out to his platoon sergeant, a veteran named DeMarco, who had been fighting since Guadalcanal, the sergeant had simply shrugged. "Don't look at the water, Lieutenant. Nothing good ever comes from looking at the water." The Kurama Islands had been secured with minimal resistance. The Japanese suicide boat bases had been captured or destroyed, and the islands were already being transformed into anchorages and supply depots for the main assault. But as K Company established their bivouac on the 3rd night, Harker had walked to the edge of the camp and looked east toward Okinawa proper, where the invasion would commence in 4 days. The island was a dark mass against the horizon, backlit by the occasional flash of naval gunfire as the pre-invasion bombardment continued. And above the ridgeline, just visible in the failing light, something like mist was rising. But not mist, too red, too deliberately shaped, flowing upward rather than settling down, forming patterns that almost resembled figures standing and watching. A corporal named Sullivan, standing watch nearby, had seen it too. "What the hell is that, sir?" Harker had no answer. The naval bombardment continued, shells arcing toward the island in long parabolic trajectories, each one visible as a streak of light before it impacted somewhere in the darkness, and the red shapes above the ridgeline seemed to multiply, growing more distinct, as though the bombardment itself were calling them into existence. "I don't know," Harker had said finally, "but we're going to find out in 4 days." The main invasion of Okinawa was scheduled for April 1st, 1945, Easter Sunday, by coincidence or design. 4 divisions would land simultaneously on the Hagushi beaches on the western coast, establishing a beachhead 8 miles wide before wheeling south to engage the main Japanese defensive positions. Intelligence estimated that the initial landings would be unopposed. The Japanese had chosen to defend the interior rather than the beaches, but that the real fighting would begin once the Americans pushed into the limestone ridges of southern Okinawa. Estimated casualties for the first 30 days, 14,000. Acceptable losses by the standards of spring 1945. But something was waiting in those ridges, in those caves that had been sacred ground for 3,000 years, something that had been disturbed by the tunneling and the fortifications and the thousands of soldiers who now lived and waited in the darkness beneath the limestone. Something that had been patient for centuries and was now, finally, awake. Lieutenant Harker didn't know this yet, None of them did. But in 4 days, 3rd Platoon, K Company, 5th Marines would land on Okinawa, and they would learn what it meant to fight on ground where the dead outnumbered the living, and where the Watchers in the caves had been waiting a very long time for visitors. The landing had been almost surreally quiet. Lieutenant Harker had gone over the side of the Amtrak, expecting the curtain of fire that had greeted them at Peleliu. Machine guns raking the beach, mortars dropping among the landing craft, the water churning with impacts and bodies. Instead, 3rd Platoon had waded ashore through gentle surf onto a beach littered with nothing more threatening than discarded fishing nets and beached sampans. The naval bombardment had lifted 15 minutes prior, and the silence that followed felt more ominous than any artillery barrage. 42 Marines spread out in tactical formation and moved inland through abandoned villages and empty fields, their rifles trained on objectives that contained no enemy. By 1100 hours, K Company had advanced nearly 3 miles without firing a shot. The Hagushi beaches were secure. Elements of the 1st and 6th Marine Divisions, along with the Army's 7th and 96th Infantry Divisions, had established a beachhead 8 miles wide and pushed inland against zero resistance. It was the largest amphibious operation in the Pacific War, and the Japanese had simply allowed it to happen. The reason became apparent as the Americans pushed deeper into the island. Every ridge to the south was fortified. Every cave entrance concealed artillery or mortars. The Japanese had traded the beaches for the high ground, and now they waited in defensive positions that had been months in the making. 3rd Platoon's objective was a map coordinate designated Hill 89, approximately 6 miles south of the landing beaches. The hill itself was an unremarkable limestone formation, heavily wooded on the northern slope and featuring several cave openings on the southern face. Intelligence reported it as a probable Japanese observation post, but reconnaissance had been unable to confirm enemy strength or disposition. Standard operating procedure: advance, make contact, call in support if necessary. Harker had led his platoon on a dozen similar operations. The pattern was always the same: probe forward until the Japanese opened fire, identify the strong point, bring up tanks or call in airstrikes, reduce the position, move to the next objective. A war of attrition fought in increments measured in yards and casualties. But as 3rd Platoon moved through the Central Valley toward their objective, Harker began to notice irregularities. The terrain itself seemed wrong, not in any way he could articulate, but in a manner that triggered the survival instincts honed by 2 years of combat. The air was too still. The temperature, which should have been uncomfortably warm, felt cold despite the midday sun. And the smell, sulfurous and organic, like rotten eggs mixed with something that reminded him of a slaughterhouse, grew stronger the farther south they moved. Platoon Sergeant DeMarco pulled alongside him at 12:47 hours as they passed through an abandoned village marked on the maps as Kakazu. The stone houses were intact but empty, doors left open, cooking pots still sitting on cold fires. Harker had seen this before: civilians fleeing ahead of the fighting, taking only what they could carry. But this felt different. The village hadn't been abandoned recently. Dust had accumulated on every surface. Spiderwebs stretched across doorways. And in one house, Harker found a family shrine with offerings that had rotted weeks ago, flowers turned to brown slime, and rice left to the insects. "They've been gone a while," DeMarco observed. "Months, maybe." Intelligence said most civilians were concentrated in the south, near the Japanese headquarters. Intelligence says a lot of things. DeMarco lit a cigarette, cupping his hand out of habit, even though there was no wind. "You feel it, Lieutenant?" "Feel what?" "Like we're being watched. Not by Japs with binoculars. Something else." The sergeant was not a superstitious man. He had survived Guadalcanal and Cape Gloucester by trusting what his eyes could see and his rifle could kill, but his voice carried an edge that Harker had not heard before. "I feel it," Harker admitted. They found the first body at 13:15 hours, 100 yards south of Kakazu village. Japanese soldier, estimated dead for approximately 2 weeks based on the state of decomposition. He wore the standard uniform of an Imperial Army infantryman, Type 98 tunic, puttees, leather combat boots. His rifle lay nearby, unfired, the safety still engaged. What made Harker call a halt and approach cautiously was the position of the body. The soldier was seated upright against a limestone outcropping, his back to the rock, his hands folded in his lap. His eyes were open, or the cavities where his eyes had been were open, and his head was tilted slightly upward, as though he had been looking at something above him when he died. Corporal Hayes, the platoon's radio man, knelt beside the body and checked for documents or identification. "No wounds, sir. Nothing I can see. He just sat down and died." "Heart attack?" Private Sullivan suggested. "Or maybe gas? We used gas on some of the caves at Paliliu." "We haven't used gas here yet," DeMarco said. "And Japs don't just sit down and die. They fight until you kill them or they kill themselves. They don't sit down and wait for it." Harker examined the soldier's hands. No defensive wounds, no sign of struggle. The man's canteen was still on his hip, 3/4 full. His pack contained rations. He had not died of thirst or starvation. He had simply stopped living in a place with no tactical value, facing away from any likely avenue of American advance. "Leave him," Harker ordered. "Mark the position on the map and keep moving. We're burning daylight." They found 7 more bodies over the next hour, all Japanese, all in similar states and positions. Some were sitting, some were lying on their backs with their arms at their sides, as though they had decided to take a nap and never woken up. None showed signs of violence. None had fired their weapons. And all of them were positioned facing south, toward the ridgeline, where Hill 89 rose like a broken tooth against the sky. At 14:30 hours, 3rd Platoon reached the base of Hill 89. The northern slope was dense with subtropical vegetation, palms and ferns and vines that formed a near impenetrable tangle. A narrow trail, probably cut by local civilians before the war, switchbacked up through the undergrowth toward the summit. Harker called a halt and assembled his squad leaders for a quick briefing. "We go up in 2 columns, 10 yards between squads. First squad takes point. Second squad follows. Third squad provides rear security. If we make contact, the point squad fixes the enemy and the rest of us flank. Questions?" "Sir," Hayes said quietly. "The radio's acting up. Can't raise battalion, just static and..." He paused, adjusting his headset. "And something else. Sounds almost like voices, but I can't make out any words." Harker took the handset and listened. Hayes was right. Beneath the static was something that resembled human speech, but distorted and layered, as though multiple people were speaking simultaneously in different languages. He had heard atmospheric interference before, skip propagation from distant radio stations bleeding into military frequencies. This was different. The cadence was wrong, the rhythm too deliberate. "Keep trying to establish contact. If you can't raise battalion in 30 minutes, we'll send a runner back." The platoon began its ascent at 14:45 hours. The trail was steep and treacherous, the limestone slick with moisture despite the lack of rain. The vegetation pressed in from both sides, reducing visibility to a few yards. Harker moved with first squad, his Thompson submachine gun held at the ready, his finger resting along the trigger guard. Behind him, the platoon climbed in silence, broken only by the scrape of boots on stone and the occasional muffled curse as someone lost their footing. At 15:07 hours, 22 minutes into the climb, they found the cave. It opened in the hillside like a mouth, approximately 8 feet high and 12 feet wide, the entrance partially concealed by hanging vines. No defensive positions were visible, no firing ports or sandbags, just the opening, and beyond it, darkness that seemed to extend far deeper than the hillside should allow. And from that darkness came a sound, low and rhythmic, almost like breathing, or like waves against a distant shore. And beneath that sound, barely audible, voices, many voices, speaking in languages Harker did not recognize, had never heard, languages that might have been dead for centuries or might have never been human at all. Platoon Sergeant DeMarco stood beside him, staring into the cave. "Lieutenant, we should call this in. Get engineers up here, maybe some flamethrower tanks. We don't know what's in there." Harker knew he was right. Standard doctrine was to bypass fortified caves and reduce them with specialized equipment. But something about the cave demanded investigation. Not tactical necessity. There was nothing strategic about this hill, no reason it needed to be cleared today or this week. But he felt compelled to look inside, the way a man might feel compelled to look over the edge of a cliff despite knowing the danger. "First squad, on me. Everyone else holds here. Hayes, set up the radio and keep trying to reach battalion." "Sir," DeMarco protested, "at least let me go with you. I need you here in case this goes wrong. If we're not back in 15 minutes, you pull the platoon back to Kakuzu and report to company." Harker took 6 Marines into the cave. They moved in single file, their rifles raised, flashlights cutting narrow beams through the darkness. The temperature dropped immediately, from subtropical warmth to something like a winter cellar. Their breath became visible in the flashlight beams. And the walls, the limestone walls that should have been rough and natural, were carved, inscribed with symbols and figures that predated any military occupation, images of human forms and animal shapes and geometric patterns that seemed to shift and rearrange themselves when viewed peripherally. 50 feet into the cave, the tunnel opened into a chamber, and in that chamber, they found the Watchers. The chamber was approximately 30 feet in diameter, the ceiling lost in darkness beyond the reach of their flashlights. The walls were covered in the same carved symbols they had seen in the tunnel, but here the carvings were more elaborate, more deliberate, not random inscriptions, but a continuous narrative that spiraled around the chamber from floor to ceiling. Lieutenant Harker traced his flashlight beam along the carvings and saw scenes of warfare, of figures with weapons that looked like spears and primitive firearms, of bodies piled in heaps, of something rising from the earth that his mind struggled to interpret as anything coherent. But what commanded immediate attention were the statues. 7 of them, arranged in a semicircle facing the chamber entrance, each approximately 8 feet tall, carved from the same limestone as the cave walls but polished smooth, their surfaces reflecting the flashlight beams with an oily sheen. They depicted humanoid figures, but not quite human. The proportions were wrong, the limbs too long, the heads too large and elongated. Their faces, if they could be called faces, were featureless except for deep-set hollows where eyes should have been. And those hollows seemed to track movement, following the Marines as they spread out to secure the chamber. "Jesus Christ," Private Sullivan whispered. "Sir, what the hell are those?" "Idols," Harker said, though he wasn't certain. "Local religious artifacts. Must be old. Pre-war, definitely. Maybe centuries old." "They're looking at us," Corporal Hayes said. His voice had gone flat, affectless. "They're watching us." "They're stone, Hayes." "They don't look at anything." But Harker felt it too. The sensation of being observed, evaluated, judged by something that possessed neither eyes nor consciousness but watched nonetheless. He moved closer to one of the statues, his Thompson raised, approaching the way he would approach an enemy position. The stone's surface was cool to the touch when he reached out to examine it, too cool given the temperature of the chamber. And beneath his hand, he could feel something, a vibration, a pulse, as though something living existed within the limestone, something ancient and patient that had been waiting in the darkness for longer than human memory could record. Behind the statues, at the far end of the chamber, an altar had been constructed from stacked limestone blocks. On the altar sat ceramic vessels, their surfaces decorated with faded pigments depicting scenes similar to those carved on the walls. And around the altar, arranged in neat rows, were bones, human bones, skulls and femurs and ribs, hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, sorted by type and stacked with a precision that suggested ritual purpose rather than random disposal. "This is a tomb," said Private First Class Nakamura, the platoon's Japanese-American translator. He had been silent until now, studying the carvings with an expression that shifted between fascination and horror. Not Japanese, Ryukyuan, pre-annexation. These symbols, some of them are ancient Chinese characters, but older versions than I've seen. And these, he pointed to a series of pictographs near the altar. These aren't writing, they're warnings. Warnings about what? Harker asked. I can't read all of it, but the ones I recognize, they talk about thresholds, about the boundary between the living world and the world of the dead, about something that watches from the other side, something that can be called through, but must never be allowed to cross over. Nakamura's flashlight beam settled on a carving that depicted humanoid figures emerging from a cave, their hands reaching toward a crowd of smaller figures who appeared to be fleeing. This one says that when too much blood soaks the earth, when too many dead remain unburied, the Watchers can cross through, that they feed on violence and suffering, that war makes the boundary weak. Old superstition, Sullivan said, but his voice carried no conviction. Maybe. Nakamura knelt beside the altar, examining the bones more closely. But whoever made this place took their superstitions seriously. These bones have been here for centuries, and look at this. He pointed to a skull that sat atop the others, positioned at the center of the altar. The skull was human but modified, the cranium carved with symbols that matched those on the statues. This was a priestess, a Noro. They used to guard places like this, conduct rituals to keep the boundary intact, to keep the Watchers on their side. Harker checked his watch. They had been in the chamber for 6 minutes. According to his orders to DeMarco, they had 9 minutes remaining before the platoon would withdraw. He needed to make a decision, secure the chamber and report its existence, or pull back and call in specialists. But as he considered the options, he noticed something that made the decision irrelevant. The bones were moving, not dramatically, not the sudden animation of a horror film, just small movements, subtle shifts, as though the skulls were slowly turning to face the entrance, as though the dead were becoming aware of the living presence in their tomb. Harker blinked, certain he was seeing things, that the flickering shadows cast by the flashlights were creating an illusion of movement. But no, the skull on the altar had definitely rotated several degrees, and the bones stacked behind it were rearranging themselves, sorting into patterns that had not existed moments before. We're leaving, Harker said. Now, back to the entrance. Sir, Hayes started to protest, but the protest died as something happened to the statues. The hollows where their eyes should have been began to glow with a faint reddish light, like embers buried in ash. And the vibration Harker had felt when he touched the stone intensified, becoming audible, a low hum that resonated in the chest and made breathing difficult. The Marines backed toward the tunnel entrance, weapons raised, flashlights sweeping across the chamber. The glow from the statue's eyes grew brighter, casting the chamber in a bloody illumination that revealed details previously hidden in shadow. The walls were not merely carved, they were covered in handprints, thousands of them, pressed into the stone with such force that they had deformed the limestone. And among the handprints were faces, screaming faces, as though people had been pushed into the walls while the stone was still soft and had been trapped there, frozen in their final moments. "Move! Move! Move!" Harker shoved his men toward the tunnel. Behind them, the humming from the statues had become a sound like voices, many voices speaking in unison, a chant or prayer in a language that predated human speech. And beneath that sound, footsteps. Something was walking in the chamber, moving through the space where nothing visible existed, approaching the tunnel entrance with measured, deliberate steps. The Marines ran. They burst from the tunnel into the daylight at 15:21 hours, 9 minutes after entering, and did not stop running until they reached the position where DeMarco had established a defensive perimeter with the rest of the platoon. Harker collapsed against a tree, gasping, his Thompson still clutched in hands that would not stop shaking. "What happened in there?" DeMarco demanded. "We heard something. It didn't sound like gunfire, but..." "Pull the platoon back. Now. We're returning to Kakazu and reporting to battalion." "Sir, what about the cave?" Harker looked back toward the entrance, 50 yards uphill. The vines that had concealed it were moving now, writhing with no wind to explain their motion. And from within the darkness, barely visible, the red glow of 7 sets of eyes stared back at him. "Mark it on the map. Call it a suspected enemy strongpoint. Recommend heavy ordnance before any follow-up attempt." DeMarco studied his lieutenant's face and asked no further questions. He had served with Harker long enough to trust his judgment, and he recognized fear when he saw it. Whatever was in that cave, it was not something 3rd Platoon could handle with rifles and grenades. The platoon began its withdrawal at 15:27 hours, moving in tactical formation but faster than standard doctrine recommended. As they descended the hill, Hayes managed to re-establish radio contact with battalion. The interference had cleared as suddenly as it had begun, and the voices beneath the static were gone. He reported their situation and received orders to return to the company perimeter and submit a full after-action report. But as 3rd Platoon moved through the valley toward Kakazu village, they began to notice changes in the terrain. The Japanese bodies they had passed on the way to Hill 89, the soldiers who had died in positions suggesting they had simply stopped living, were gone. Not dragged away, not buried, but gone, leaving only dark stains on the ground where they had lain. And in the trees alongside the trail, figures stood watching. Harker saw them peripherally, dark shapes among the foliage that resembled human silhouettes, but moved with a fluidity that was distinctly inhuman. When he turned his head to look directly, the figures were never there. But in his peripheral vision, they multiplied. Dozens of them, hundreds, keeping pace with the platoon as it withdrew. Private Nakamura, walking beside Harker, was murmuring something in Japanese. A prayer, perhaps, or a ward against evil. When Harker asked him what he was saying, the translator's response was quiet and fatalistic. "My grandmother told me stories about Okinawa, about places where the boundary is thin. She said if you ever found yourself in such a place, you should pray and leave offerings, and never, ever disturb the guardians." He looked back toward Hill 89, barely visible now through the trees. "We disturbed them, sir. We went into their tomb and we shined lights on them and we woke them up. And now they're awake, they're going to want something in return." "What do they want?" Harker asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "The same thing they've always wanted. Blood death, suffering, the things that make the boundary weak, the things that let them cross over. 3rd Platoon reached Kakazu village at 1648 hours, 41 men instead of 42. Private Sullivan was missing. No one had seen him fall or heard him cry out. One moment he had been there, walking in the middle of the column. The next moment he was gone, as though the jungle had simply opened and swallowed him. A search party went back along the trail, but found no trace, no blood, no signs of struggle, no body. Just his rifle, leaning against a tree exactly where his position in the column would have been, and his helmet sitting on top of the rifle, positioned with a precision that suggested deliberate arrangement rather than random loss. That night, as K Company established defensive positions in and around Kakazu, Lieutenant Harker sat in a commandeered house and attempted to write his after-action report. He described the cave as a suspected enemy position. He described the chamber as a possible ammunition dump or headquarters location. He described the statues as religious artifacts of unknown purpose. He did not describe the glowing eyes or the moving bones or the voices that had spoken in languages older than civilization. He did not describe the Watchers who had followed them through the jungle or the way Sullivan had vanished without a trace. He submitted the report at 2200 hours and received acknowledgement from Battalion that follow-up operations would be planned pending prioritization of objectives. Standard military response. Somewhere up the chain of command, an operations officer would evaluate the tactical importance of Hill 89 and assign it a priority relative to other objectives in the sector. It might be days or weeks before anyone went back to that cave. By then, Harker hoped, the Watchers would have returned to their sleep, but he knew they wouldn't. Something had been awakened that would not return to dormancy easily. The boundary Nakamura had described, the threshold between the world of the living and whatever lay beyond, had been weakened not just by 3rd Platoon's intrusion, but by the war itself. By the thousands of men who had died on Okinawa in the 3 days since the invasion began. By the tens of thousands who would die in the months to come. By the blood and violence and suffering that was only beginning. The Watchers had been patient for centuries. Now they were awake, and the war was feeding them. Eight days had passed since 3rd Platoon's encounters on Hill 89. 8 days of grinding advance through terrain that fought back with every yard surrendered. The 96th Infantry Division had been fed into the meat grinder of Kakazu Ridge, a limestone escarpment approximately 500 yards long and rising nearly 100 feet above the surrounding valley, and had been bled white in repeated assaults that gained nothing but casualty figures. The Japanese defenders dug into caves and fortified positions on the reverse slope had turned the ridge into a killing ground. Every approach was pre-registered for mortar and artillery fire. Every gap in the defenses concealed machine gun positions that opened fire only when American infantry were too committed to withdraw. K Company had been attached to the 381st Infantry Regiment, 96th Division, to provide combat experience and leadership to units that had not yet adapted to the unique horror of fighting in limestone caves. Lieutenant Harker's platoon, now reduced to 34 men after a week of sporadic contact and the mysterious disappearances that had claimed 3 more Marines, occupied a position at the base of Kakazu Ridge, 200 yards from the nearest Japanese-held cave. They had been in position for 16 hours, enduring sporadic mortar fire and waiting for orders to either advance or withdraw. But the orders that came at 0330 hours were neither. Battalion reported that units farther south, attacking a position designated Kakazu West, had encountered something that defied standard tactical response. Communications with 2 companies of the 381st had been lost simultaneously at 0312 hours. The last radio transmission, according to Battalion, consisted of weapons fire, screaming, and a phrase repeated multiple times by an unknown voice. They're coming from inside the caves, but they're not Japanese. 3rd Platoon was ordered to move south, link up with any survivors, and report on the situation. Standard reconnaissance mission, except that nothing about Kakazu Ridge had been standard since the assault began. The Japanese defenses were formidable enough, but over the past week, soldiers from multiple units had reported encounters that military training could not explain. Figures moving through the caves that cast no shadows, voices speaking in languages no translator could identify, entire squads vanishing during night movements with no evidence of enemy action. The incidents were logged as combat stress reactions, shell shock cases, the psychological breakdown inevitable when men fought in conditions that reduced human existence to a struggle for survival in darkness. But Harker knew better. He had seen the Watchers. He had felt the pulse of something ancient and malevolent in that chamber on Hill 89. And he understood, with the certainty of a man who had crossed a threshold he could never return through, that the war on Okinawa was being fought on 2 fronts, one against the Japanese Empire and one against something that had existed long before empires and would exist long after they had turned to dust. 3rd Platoon moved out at 0350 hours, advancing through a valley that had been designated the Gorge, a natural corridor between Kakazu Ridge and the next defensive position to the south. The darkness was absolute. Cloud cover blocked the stars, and the only illumination came from distant artillery flashes that briefly painted the landscape in shades of orange and black. The Marines moved in single file, maintaining contact through touch, their weapons held ready, but their effectiveness questionable in conditions where visibility extended no more than a few feet. At 0408 hours, they encountered the first body. Specialist Rogers from 3rd Platoon knelt beside it, his flashlight revealing an American soldier, Army 96th Division by the uniform, lying face down in the mud. The body was fresh, the blood still liquid, but when Rogers turned the soldier over, Harker saw that the man's chest had been opened from sternum to navel, the ribs spread wide, and the organs removed with a precision that suggested surgical skill rather than battlefield trauma. "Jesus," Rogers whispered. "What the fuck did this?" "Japanese don't mutilate bodies," Platoon Sergeant DeMarco said. "Not like this. This is something else." They found 11 more bodies over the next 50 yards. All American. All killed within the past hour based on body temperature and lividity. And all opened in the same manner. Their organs removed, their blood drained so thoroughly that the surrounding ground showed no signs of the carnage that should have accompanied such wounds. The bodies were arranged in a pattern, not scattered by combat, but positioned deliberately, forming a rough circle with the chest cavities facing inward, as though whatever had killed them wanted the corpses to watch each other. At 0423 hours, 3rd Platoon reached the position where the 2 companies of the 381 had last reported. The terrain was a nightmare of shell holes and destroyed vegetation, the ground torn by recent artillery fire. Abandoned equipment lay everywhere, rifles, helmets, packs, entrenching tools, all of it dropped or discarded in what appeared to be a panicked withdrawal. But no bodies. Approximately 200 men had occupied this position 4 hours ago, and now there was no trace of them beyond the evidence of their hasty departure. "Spread out," Harker ordered. "Search for survivors, documents, anything that tells us what happened here." The platoon dispersed in 2-man teams, clearing the position with tactical precision born of 2 years' combat experience. Harker moved with Corporal Hayes, the radio man, toward what appeared to be a command post, a shallow dugout reinforced with sandbags and timber. Inside, they found a field telephone, its wire cut, and a map board showing the disposition of forces. The map had been marked with grease pencil, showing the planned assault route toward Kakazu West. But someone had drawn additional symbols on the map, symbols that matched the carvings Harker had seen in the chamber on Hill 89. And across the bottom of the map, written in what looked like charcoal or blood, was a single word in Japanese characters. "Nakamura," Harker called. The translator appeared moments later, his face drawn. "What does this say?" Nakamura studied the characters for a long moment before responding. "It says Majamun, demons, spirits, the monsters from the old stories." He looked at Harker with eyes that had seen too much in too short a time. "Someone here knew what they were fighting, sir. Someone knew and tried to warn the others." A burst of rifle fire erupted from the eastern perimeter of the position, then another, then sustained automatic fire from what sounded like a Browning automatic rifle. Harker grabbed his Thompson and ran toward the sound, Hayes following with the radio handset pressed to his ear, trying to raise the Marines who had opened fire. They found Private First Class Chen and Private Martinez behind an overturned Amtrak, firing into the darkness toward a cave opening approximately 30 yards distant. The cave was one of dozens that honeycombed Kakazu Ridge, this one positioned at ground level and roughly 10 feet in diameter. From within the cave, shapes were emerging, human in silhouette but wrong in proportion and movement, flowing out of the darkness like oil spreading across water. "Contact!" Chen was shouting into the darkness, his rifle firing on semi-automatic, placing rounds into the approaching figures with the mechanical precision of a trained rifleman. "Contact! Multiple hostiles! Coming from the cave." The figures kept coming. Harker saw Chen's rounds impact, saw the jacket of one figure burst open, saw what should have been a fatal wound, but the figure continued advancing without slowing. Martinez's bar opened up, 20-round magazine emptying in a sustained burst that should have cut down anything human. The figures stumbled, several falling, but others flowed around them, their movements synchronized in a way that was distinctly inhuman. "Fall back," Harker ordered. He opened fire with his Thompson, the .45 caliber rounds punching through the nearest figure with visible exit wounds. The figure collapsed into something that was not quite solid, its form dissolving into a red mist that hung in the air before slowly settling toward the ground. "Fighting withdrawal to the rally point. Move!" Third platoon converged on Harker's position, forming a defensive perimeter around the command post. The figures from the cave had multiplied, dozens of them now visible in the darkness, illuminated by muzzle flashes and the occasional pop of a flare. In the harsh magnesium light, Harker saw them clearly for the first time. They wore uniforms, Japanese, American, even what looked like ancient Ryukyuan clothing. But the uniforms were rotted, hanging from frames that seemed to shift and flow beneath the fabric. Their faces, where visible, were featureless expanses of gray-white flesh, like the statues in the chamber, but organic, moving, alive in a way that violated every natural law. "They're coming from all the caves," DeMarco shouted. He was firing controlled bursts from his M1 Garand, each shot placed with the precision of a man who had survived multiple campaigns. "Every cave on the ridge, they're all opening up." He was right. Harker turned and saw them emerging from cave mouths all along the base of Kakazu Ridge. Hundreds of them, perhaps thousands. An army of the dead, animated by something that had been disturbed by the war, called into existence by the blood and suffering that had soaked into the limestone over 8 days of brutal combat. They moved with terrible coordination, converging on 3rd Platoon's position from multiple directions, their approach relentless and unstoppable. "Hayes, get battalion on the radio. Tell them we need immediate fire support. Everything they can give us. Artillery, mortars, airstrikes, anything." Hayes was already working the radio, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. Tombstone 6, this is Tombstone 3-1, fire mission over." Static answered him. He adjusted frequency and tried again. Any station, this is Tombstone 3-1, requesting immediate fire support. Over. Nothing. The radio was dead, or the atmospheric conditions were blocking transmission, or something else was interfering with the signal. They were alone, surrounded by an enemy that should not exist, in darkness that concealed numbers and intent. "Sir," Nakamura said quietly. He was standing beside Harker, his rifle raised but not firing, his expression one of resignation rather than fear. "They're not trying to kill us. Not yet. They're hurting us." "Hurting us where?" "Toward the caves. They want us to go inside. That's where the boundary is thinnest. That's where they can—" He paused, searching for words in a language that had no vocabulary for what he was trying to describe. "Where they can take us, cross us over, make us like them." "That's not happening." Harker fired another burst into the nearest group of figures. They dissolved into mist, but more appeared behind them, flowing out of the darkness like a tide that could not be stopped. "We break through to the south, get clear of the ridge and call in fire on our current position. Burn it all. The caves, the figures, everything." "Sir, we've got wounded. We carry them. No one gets left behind." The platoon formed up for the breakout. 34 Marines against an enemy that numbered in the hundreds and could not be killed by conventional means. The odds were suicidal, but surrender was not an option, and standing fast meant being slowly overwhelmed. They moved as a unit, firing and maneuvering in the disciplined manner that had been drilled into them through countless training exercises and combat operations. The figures parted before them, not retreating, but redirecting, flowing around the edges of the platoon's formation, trying to split them into smaller groups that could be isolated and herded toward the caves. Private Chin went down first, dragged backward by hands that emerged from the ground itself, pulled beneath the surface before anyone could react. Martinez turned to help him and was grabbed by multiple figures, his screams cutting off abruptly as they bore him down and dragged him toward the nearest cave entrance. Harker tried to reach him, but DeMarco grabbed his arm and pulled him back. "He's gone, Lieutenant. We have to keep moving." They ran. The disciplined withdrawal became a rout, became a desperate scramble through darkness lit only by muzzle flashes and the occasional flare. The figures pursued them, flowing through the terrain with a speed that should have been impossible. Men fell, grabbed from behind, pulled into shell holes, simply vanishing between one step and the next. Harker lost count of how many. He fired his Thompson until the magazine was empty, reloaded, fired again, the mechanical action of combat the only thing keeping his mind from shattering under the weight of what he was witnessing. They broke clear of Kakazu Ridge at 0456 hours, emerging into relatively open ground where the figures seemed reluctant to follow. Harker counted heads and found 13 Marines still with him. 13 out of 34 who had entered the gorge less than an hour earlier. They collapsed in a defensive perimeter, gasping, some weeping, all of them changed in ways that would never fully heal. Behind them, the caves of Kakazu Ridge pulsed with a faint red glow, and from within those caves, Harker could hear singing, thousands of voices raised in a chant that predated language, a sound that was simultaneously beautiful and utterly horrifying. The Watchers had claimed their tribute, and the war was only beginning. "19 days into the campaign, the American advance had ground to a complete halt against the Shuri line, the main Japanese defensive position anchored on Shuri Castle and extending across the entire width of southern Okinawa. The 96th Infantry Division had been effectively destroyed as a fighting force, suffering over 3,000 casualties in the failed assaults on Kakazu Ridge. The 27th Infantry Division, committed to relieve them, had fared no better. And now the 1st Marine Division, Harker's parent unit, had been ordered into the line to break the stalemate. But the stalemate was not purely tactical. Over the past 2 weeks, reports had filtered up through the chain of command that described encounters similar to what 3rd Platoon had experienced. Entire squads vanishing during cave-clearing operations. Soldiers found dead with no visible wounds, their bodies positioned in ritualistic patterns. Equipment failures that could not be explained by mechanical malfunction or enemy action. And the caves themselves, the hundreds of caves that honeycombed the limestone ridges, had taken on a malevolent character that transcended their function as defensive positions. At 0830 hours on the 19th of April, Lieutenant Harker, now commanding what remained of K Company after the original company commander had been killed in an artillery barrage, received orders to clear a cave complex designated Target Baker 7. Intelligence indicated the complex served as a battalion headquarters for Japanese forces defending the Shuri Line. Standard cave clearing procedure: seal the entrances with demolitions, use flamethrowers to burn out defenders who refuse to surrender, send in infantry to secure the interior. Estimated time to complete: 4 hours. Estimated casualties: acceptable. But Harker had learned enough about the caves of Okinawa to know that nothing was standard and no casualties were acceptable when fighting an enemy that existed simultaneously in the material world and somewhere else. He had requested engineers with specialized equipment, psychological warfare teams with interpreters who understood Ryukyuan culture, even chaplains who might have knowledge of exorcism or spiritual protection. His requests had been denied or ignored. He had 47 Marines, 6 flamethrower teams, and a platoon of combat engineers with satchel charges. That was what the Marine Corps could spare, and that was what he would use. The cave entrance was located at the base of a limestone escarpment approximately 2 miles south of Kakazu Ridge. Unlike the smaller caves they had encountered previously, this opening was large enough to drive a truck through, roughly 15 feet high and 20 feet wide, the entrance reinforced with timber and concrete, clearly modified for military use. No defensive fire came from the entrance. No movement was visible in the darkness beyond. The silence was absolute and unnatural, as though the cave were holding its breath. Harker assembled his company in a staging area 200 yards from the entrance. The flamethrower teams prepared their equipment, checking fuel levels and ignition systems. The engineers armed their satchel charges, canvas bags loaded with composition C2, explosive and white phosphorus, designed to create maximum heat and concussive effect in confined spaces. The riflemen checked their weapons and prepared for close quarters combat in darkness where every shadow could conceal an enemy and every sound could be a threat or a hallucination. At 1530 hours, the assault commenced. 2 flamethrower teams advanced to the cave entrance under covering fire from the riflemen, their weapons spewing streams of ignited fuel into the darkness. The napalm-based mixture adhered to stone and timber, creating a curtain of fire that should have forced any defenders deeper into the cave or burned them alive. For 30 seconds, the flamethrowers operated continuously, filling the entrance with flame and smoke. Then they ceased fire and withdrew, allowing the engineers to advance with their explosives. But as the smoke cleared, Harker saw that the cave interior showed no sign of damage. The flames had burned and died, but the stone walls were not scorched. The timber supports showed no charring. It was as though the fire had been absorbed rather than resisted, consumed by something that fed on heat and light and left nothing behind but darkness. "Hit it again," Harker ordered. "Double duration. I want that cave glowing." The flamethrower teams advanced and fired again, this time maintaining their streams for a full minute. The heat was intense enough that Harker could feel it from 200 yards away, intense enough that the engineers had to retreat to avoid burns. 2,000 gallons of jellied gasoline poured into that cave entrance, burning at temperatures that should have incinerated anything organic and fractured the limestone itself. When the flames died, the cave remained unchanged, and from within its depths came a sound, low and rhythmic, like breathing, like the tide, like thousands of voices speaking in unison. The sound grew louder, and with it came a wind that blew outward from the cave, a cold wind that smelled of earth and bone and something sweet and rotting that made men gag and turn away. "Fall back," Harker shouted. But it was too late. The wind intensified, becoming a gale that knocked men off their feet and scattered equipment across the staging area. And with the wind came the figures. They emerged from the cave not as individuals, but as a mass, a flowing torrent of forms that seemed to pour from the entrance like water from a broken dam. They wore the faces of the dead, Japanese soldiers, American Marines, Okinawan civilians, warriors from centuries past whose armor had corroded to fragments but whose weapons remained sharp. They moved with that terrible coordination Harker had witnessed at Kakuzu Ridge, but now they moved with purpose, with fury, as though the flamethrowers had awakened something that had been merely watching and transformed it into something that was ready to act. The Marines opened fire. M1 Garands, BARS, Thompson submachine guns, all firing on full automatic, pouring rounds into the advancing mass. The figures fell, dissolved into red mist, reformed and continued advancing. The flamethrower teams attempted to engage at close range, but the figures moved through the flames as though immune to heat, their forms briefly illuminated before disappearing back into the smoke. "Satchel charges," Harker ordered. "Engineers, hit them with everything." The combat engineers threw their charges into the densest concentrations of figures. The explosions were massive, white phosphorus burning at 3,000 degrees, C2 creating overpressure waves that should have pulped human tissue. The figures were thrown back, torn apart, scattered across the field, but within seconds they were reforming, pulling themselves back together from the mist and the fragments, rising again with an inevitability that was more terrifying than any human assault. The Marines broke, not all at once, not in a panicked rout, but in small groups as men realized that their weapons were useless and their training was meaningless against an enemy that could not be killed. They fell back toward the assembly area, carrying their wounded, firing as they withdrew. Harker attempted to maintain unit cohesion, but the situation had deteriorated beyond any tactical response he had been trained to implement. And then Private Nakamura did something that Harker would never fully understand. The translator, who had been with 3rd Platoon since the landing and had survived Kakuzu Ridge, walked forward toward the advancing figures. He had discarded his rifle and helmet. In his hands, he carried a small ceramic vessel, one of the artifacts he had taken from the chamber on Hill 89 without Harker's knowledge or permission. Nakamura began to speak in Ryukyuan, the old language of the islands, words that sounded like prayer or incantation or both. The figures stopped. Not slowly, not gradually, but instantly, as though Nakamura's words carried a command that overrode whatever force animated them. They stood motionless in the field, their eyeless faces turned toward the translator, waiting. Nakamura continued speaking, his voice growing stronger, and as he spoke, he poured something from the ceramic vessel onto the ground, water, or sake, or blood. Harker could not tell from his position. "He's making an offering," Platoon Sergeant DeMarco said quietly. "Look at what he's doing. It's a ritual. He's trying to negotiate with them." "Negotiate what?" "Safe passage. Recognition. I don't know. But whatever he's saying, they're listening." Nakamura spoke for perhaps 5 minutes. Then he fell silent, replaced the stopper in the ceramic vessel, and walked backward toward the Marine lines, never turning his back on the figures. They watched him retreat, but did not follow. When Nakamura reached Harker's position, he collapsed, his face pale and his hands shaking. "What did you do?" Harker asked. I gave them what they wanted: acknowledgement, respect, recognition that this is their ground, their sacred place, and we are the intruders. Nakamura's voice was hoarse, exhausted. I told them we would leave offerings at the cave entrances: water, sake, rice, the traditional gifts for the dead. And in return, they would allow us passage. They would not hunt us actively. They would only defend what is theirs. That's not a military solution. That's survival, sir. That's the only solution that works against something that can't be killed. Nakamura looked at the figures, still motionless in the field. They've been here for thousands of years. They were here before the Japanese military fortified the caves. They'll be here after we're all dead and forgotten. All they want is recognition and blood. Always blood. But if we give them the recognition, maybe they'll be satisfied with the blood that's already been spilled. Harker looked at the cave entrance, at the figures standing guard before it, at the 47 Marines who remained of his command. He made a decision that would never appear in any official report. Mark, this cave is cleared. Report to battalion that the position was empty. No enemy contact. We're moving to the next objective. Sir, that's falsifying. That's an order, Sergeant. K Company withdrew from Target Baker 7 at 16:12 hours, leaving the cave and its guardians undisturbed. Behind them, the figures watched until the Marines were out of sight, then slowly began to flow back into the cave, returning to whatever darkness had spawned them. The entrance remained open, waiting, patient. And at the threshold, Nakamura had left his offering, the ceramic vessel filled with water from his canteen, and beside it, a handful of rice from his rations, and on top of the rice, a single dog tag, his own, given freely as acknowledgement that he understood what he had witnessed and would carry the knowledge of it for whatever remained of his life. The war on Okinawa would continue for another 2 months. 77,000 casualties would be sustained by American forces. The exact number of Japanese military and civilian dead would never be accurately determined, but estimates exceeded 100,000. The island would be secured, and it would serve its purpose as a staging ground for operations against the Japanese home islands, operations that would become unnecessary after atomic weapons were employed at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But in the caves beneath the limestone ridges of southern Okinawa, the Watchers remained. They had been fed by the war, strengthened by the blood and suffering, but they had also been acknowledged, given recognition by men who understood that some forces transcend military doctrine and political objectives. The balance had been maintained, barely. The boundary had held, barely. And the dead, both old and new, had been given their due. Lieutenant James Harker would survive the Battle of Okinawa. He would return to the United States, receive his discharge, and attempt to resume a normal life. But he would never forget what he had seen in those caves, and he would never be entirely certain that he had truly left Okinawa behind. Sometimes in dreams, he would find himself back in that chamber on Hill 89, standing before the 7 statues with their glowing eyes, listening to voices that spoke in languages older than human memory. And sometimes he would wake to find red mist seeping under his bedroom door, and he would lie awake until dawn, waiting for it to dissipate, knowing that it would return. The battle for Okinawa officially ended on 21st June 1945, 82 days after the initial landing. The 10th Army had secured the island at a cost that exceeded all projections: 12,520 American dead, 38,916 wounded, and 33,096 non-battle casualties, many of them psychiatric cases that would later be attributed to the unprecedented intensity and duration of the combat. Japanese casualties were estimated at over 110,000 military personnel killed, with civilian deaths potentially exceeding 100,000 when accounting for those who committed suicide, were killed in the crossfire, or died from starvation and disease. The island had become a graveyard, its soil so saturated with blood that certain areas would remain barren for years after the war ended. Lieutenant Harker, recently promoted to captain in recognition of his leadership during the Shuri Line assault, sat in a tent at Camp Hansen, preparing after-action reports for submission to division headquarters. The administrative work of war continued even after the fighting stopped, an endless process of documentation and analysis designed to extract lessons from carnage. He had written reports on tactics and equipment, on the effectiveness of artillery support, and the challenges of cave warfare. He had submitted recommendations on unit organization and the integration of flamethrower teams. All of it factual, precise, valuable to the planners preparing for the invasion of Japan itself. What he had not written, what he could never write in an official capacity, was any mention of the Watchers. The encounters in the caves had been logged as enemy contact, the casualties attributed to Japanese defenders, the equipment failures explained as mechanical malfunction or operator error. The disappearances, and there had been many dozens of men from K Company alone and hundreds across the entire 10th Army, were classified as missing in action, presumed killed, their remains likely in collapsed caves or blown to fragments by artillery. Clean explanations, rational explanations, explanations that allowed the chain of command to maintain the fiction that they understood the nature of the enemy they had been fighting. But Harker knew, and so did the survivors of 3rd Platoon, the 13 Marines who had escaped from Kakazu Ridge in the early morning hours of April 9th. They knew that the caves of Okinawa contained something that transcended military opposition, something that had been awakened by the war and fed by the suffering, something that would not return to dormancy simply because the shooting had stopped. Private First Class Nakamura had been evacuated to a hospital ship on the 3rd of May, officially diagnosed with combat exhaustion and severe malnutrition. Unofficially, according to the medical officer who examined him, Nakamura had stopped eating on the 20th of April, the day after the incident at Target Baker 7, and had been found in his foxhole speaking to people who were not there, conducting elaborate rituals with offerings of water and rice arranged in patterns that matched the carvings on the cave walls. He had been sedated, restrained, and removed from the line. Harker had visited him once before he was shipped out, finding him in a cot in the field hospital, staring at nothing, his lips moving in constant prayer or incantation. "They're still watching," Nakamura had whispered when Harker approached. "They're in every cave, every tunnel, every hole in the ground. We thought we were clearing Japanese positions, but we were walking through their temples, their burial grounds, their sacred places. We desecrated everything they held holy, and they've marked us for it. All of us, everyone who fought here. We're marked. You did what you had to do. You made an offering. You gave them recognition. It wasn't enough. It will never be enough. Not after what we did to this island." Nakamura's eyes had focused briefly on Harker, and in them was a knowledge that went beyond madness into something like prophecy. "They'll follow us home, Captain. Some of us anyway. The ones who went deepest into the caves. The ones who killed in the darkness. The ones who disturbed the bones. They'll follow us, and they'll wait. And when we're old and dying, they'll be there at the end, watching, always watching." Harker had left the hospital convinced that Nakamura was suffering from a psychological break, that the stress of combat had fractured something in his mind that might never heal. But over the following weeks, as more men were evacuated with similar symptoms, as the psychiatric casualty rate climbed to levels that alarmed medical staff, Harker began to understand that what Nakamura had experienced was not unique. Hundreds of soldiers and Marines across the 10th Army were reporting nightmares, hallucinations, the sensation of being watched by something that existed just beyond the range of perception. Some claimed to see figures in their peripheral vision, shapes that resembled the statues from the caves, tall and elongated and featureless. Some reported hearing voices speaking in languages they could not identify but somehow understood, voices that whispered of debts unpaid and boundaries violated. The official diagnosis was combat fatigue, shell shock, operational exhaustion. The treatments were rest, sedation, and in severe cases, evacuation to psychiatric facilities in Hawaii or the continental United States. No medical officer would acknowledge that what the men were experiencing might be something other than psychological trauma. To do so would require acknowledging that the materialism underpinning modern warfare, the belief that all problems could be solved through sufficient application of force, was incomplete, that there were dimensions to combat that extended beyond the physical and tactical. But evidence accumulated nonetheless. On the 14th of May, a squad from the 7th Infantry Division, conducting mop-up operations near Shuri Castle, had entered a cave system that their maps indicated had been cleared 3 weeks prior. They found the cave occupied, not by Japanese soldiers, but by something else. The squad's radio transmission, preserved in the division signal log, consisted of weapons fire, screaming, and a final message from the squad leader. "They're not men. Jesus Christ, they're not men. The transmission ended. A rescue party found the cave empty, except for the squad's equipment, neatly arranged in a circle, and on the cave walls, carved in fresh limestone, symbols that matched those found in the ancient chamber on Hill 89. On 27th May, engineers demolishing a particularly extensive cave complex reported that their explosives had produced unexpected results. The charges had detonated correctly, and the cave entrances had collapsed as planned. But 3 hours later, local civilians reported hearing sounds from within the sealed caves, voices singing, the rhythm of drums, the chanting of prayers in the old Ryukyuan language. When engineers returned to investigate, they found the rubble cleared away from the inside, the entrances reopened, and inside the caves, fresh offerings of food and water arranged before stone altars that the engineers swore had not been there during their initial survey. These incidents were documented, investigated, and then quietly suppressed. Division intelligence officers conducted interviews, collected physical evidence, and compiled reports that were immediately classified. The official explanation, when explanations were offered at all, attributed the incidents to holdout Japanese soldiers, civilian looters, or the psychological effects of combat stress on observation reliability. No mention was made of the possibility that Okinawa itself, the island, the earth, the limestone caves that had served as sacred sites for millennia, might have been fundamentally altered by 3 months of industrial warfare. Platoon Sergeant DeMarco had survived the battle and was preparing to return to the United States, having accumulated sufficient points for discharge. Harker found him on the afternoon of the 23rd of June, sitting outside his tent and cleaning his rifle for what he said would be the last time. "You think they'll let us go?" DeMarco asked without preamble. "The Watchers. You think they'll let us leave this island and forget what we saw?" "I don't think they have a choice. The war's over. We're going home." "Are we?" DeMarco set down his cleaning rod and looked at Harker with eyes that had seen too much. "Because I'm not sure we can leave, Captain. Not really. Part of us is still in those caves. Part of us will always be in those caves. And I think part of them is coming with us." Harker had no response. He knew DeMarco was right. The boundary between the living and the dead, between the material world and whatever lay beyond, had been damaged by the war on Okinawa. Thousands of men had died in the caves, their bodies unrecovered, their spirits unquiet. Tens of thousands of civilians had perished, many of them in those same caves, driven underground by the fighting and sealed inside by explosives or starvation. The island had become a vast ossuary, a repository for the dead of multiple nations and cultures, and the Watchers, whatever they were, whether spirits or demons, or something else entirely, had been strengthened beyond anything their ancient guardians could have imagined. "If they follow us," Harker said finally, "then we deal with it. We survived 3 months of combat on this island. We can survive whatever comes after." "Can we?" DeMarco's question hung in the air, unanswered and unanswerable. The 1st Marine Division departed Okinawa on the 30th of June, 1945, boarding transport ships for the return journey to the United States. As the ships cleared the harbor and turned east toward the open Pacific, Harker stood on deck and watched the island recede into the distance. The limestone ridges were visible for a long time, gray-white formations rising from the green vegetation, honeycombed with caves that would never be fully explored or understood. And, as the island disappeared below the horizon, Harker thought he saw, or imagined he saw, red mist rising from those ridges, spreading across the water, following the ships as they sailed away. The war would end 7 weeks later with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The invasion of Japan, for which Okinawa was supposed to serve as a staging ground, would never occur. The island would be occupied by American forces, would become a major military base, would be returned to Japanese administration in 1972 while retaining American military presence to the present day. The caves would be sealed, opened, explored by archaeologists and tourists and soldiers in training. The history of the battle would be written and rewritten, analyzed and commemorated, reduced to statistics and lessons, and the honored memory of the dead. But the Watchers would remain, in the sealed caves and the open ones, in the limestone depths where ancient altars still received offerings from those who remembered, in the boundaries between light and dark where the dead kept their vigil. They would remain, patient and eternal, waiting for the next disturbance, the next war, the next opportunity to cross through and remind the living that some places are sacred, some boundaries should not be violated, and some debts can never be fully paid. Captain James Harker would carry that knowledge for the rest of his life. And sometimes, in the years to come, he would wake in the night to find red mist seeping under his door. And he would know that the Watchers had not forgotten him, would never forget him, and that when his time came to cross the final boundary, they would be waiting on the other side. Seven years after the battle ended, Colonel Raymond Ashworth, assigned to review and prepare the official history of Marine Corps operations in the Pacific War, discovered an irregularity in the casualty records from Okinawa. The 1st Marine Division had reported 1,150 killed in action during the campaign, with an additional 387 listed as missing in action, presumed killed. But when Ashworth cross-referenced these figures with burial records, unit mourning reports, and hospital evacuation logs, he found a discrepancy of approximately 200 individuals, men whose names appeared on casualty lists, but whose deaths could not be corroborated by any physical evidence. No bodies had been recovered, no graves had been registered, no hospital records existed. They had simply vanished during the campaign, their disappearances noted and filed, and never investigated beyond the perfunctory assumption that they had been killed in caves that subsequently collapsed or were sealed by enemy action. 200 men erased from existence with nothing but paperwork to mark their passing. Ashworth was a methodical man, a career officer who had spent the war in staff positions and understood the bureaucratic mechanisms of military record-keeping. Discrepancies of this magnitude did not occur accidentally. They suggested either administrative incompetence on a stunning scale or deliberate falsification of records. He began to investigate, pulling files from archives, interviewing officers who had served in the division, requesting after-action reports from subordinate units. What he found disturbed him more than any enemy action he had studied in his years of military service. Multiple units reported encounters that defied rational explanation, cave systems that appeared empty on initial reconnaissance but were found occupied by unidentified forces hours later, defensive positions that should have been cleared, showing signs of renewed occupation with no explanation for how enemy forces could have infiltrated. Entire squads disappearing during routine patrols, their equipment found arranged in patterns that suggested ritual rather than combat. And underlying all of these reports, a consistent theme: figures that did not behave like Japanese soldiers, that moved in ways human anatomy should not permit, that seemed to emerge from and dissolve back into red mist that clung to the ground despite wind and weather. The reports had been filed, logged, and then quietly reclassified. Not suppressed entirely, the documents still existed in the archives, but buried under security classifications that ensured they would never be included in official histories or made available to researchers. Someone at some level of command had decided that certain aspects of the Okinawa campaign should not be publicly acknowledged. Ashworth found his answer in a confidential memorandum dated 14 July 1945, written by Major General Roy Geiger, commanding general of 3rd Amphibious Corps during the Okinawa campaign. The memorandum, addressed to Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz and marked "Eyes Only," described a situation that Geiger characterized as beyond the scope of conventional military operations. He reported that multiple units across the 10th Army had encountered phenomena that could not be explained by reference to Japanese defensive tactics or psychological warfare. He noted that morale and combat effectiveness had been significantly impaired in certain units, not by enemy action, but by factors that intelligence officers were unable to identify or counter. And he recommended, in carefully diplomatic language, that certain sectors of southern Okinawa be designated as off-limits to all military personnel pending further investigation by specialists in fields that he did not specify but implied were not strictly military. Admiral Nimitz's response, dated 22 July 1945, was brief and unambiguous. Recommend sealing all relevant documentation under security classification pending post-war review. No further investigation to be conducted at this time. All personnel with direct knowledge of incidents described in your memorandum to be interviewed and counseled regarding operational security requirements. The investigation had been shut down. The witnesses had been interviewed. Ashworth found records of these interviews, heavily redacted, and then dispersed to different units, shipped home, or in some cases transferred to psychiatric facilities where their accounts could be dismissed as combat-induced mental illness. The caves themselves had been sealed with explosives, filled with rubble, or in some cases simply declared off-limits with no explanation provided to subordinate commands. And the pattern had continued after the war ended. Ashworth discovered that between 1945 and 1950, during the period when American forces occupied Okinawa, there had been 73 incidents involving military personnel who entered cave systems without authorization and either disappeared or emerged claiming to have encountered something that security officers classified as hallucinations brought on by carbon monoxide poisoning or oxygen deprivation. The caves in question were subsequently sealed and placed under guard, with access restricted to personnel with special clearances that Ashworth himself did not possess. He compiled his findings into a draft report that he intended to submit to the Commandant of the Marine Corps, arguing that the historical record was incomplete and that the families of the missing men deserved more than bureaucratic ambiguity. He worked on the report for 3 weeks, cross-referencing documents, interviewing survivors when he could locate them, building a case that the official history of the Okinawa campaign had been deliberately sanitized to remove elements that contradicted the narrative of a hard-fought but conventional military victory. On the 8th of October 1952, Colonel Ashworth was summoned to a meeting with a civilian he had never met, a man who introduced himself as Dr. Marcus Webb and provided no credentials beyond a letter of authorization bearing the signature of the Secretary of Defense. The meeting took place in a windowless conference room, and Dr. Webb brought with him a briefcase containing photographs that Ashworth had never seen but immediately recognized. The photographs showed the interior of caves on Okinawa, stone altars covered with offerings, carved walls depicting scenes of warfare and death spanning centuries, and statues, 7 of them, arranged in a semicircle, their eyeless faces turned toward the camera with what could only be described as malevolent attention. These were taken in 1946, Dr. Webb said, without preamble, by a team I supervised, specialists in cultural anthropology and comparative religion. We were asked to investigate certain phenomena that occurred during the battle and to determine whether they represented actual supernatural activity or could be explained through conventional means. "And what did you determine?" Ashworth asked. "That the question itself is meaningless. Whether the Watchers are literal spirits of the dead or some form of collective psychological projection made manifest through mechanisms we don't understand is irrelevant. What matters is that they exist, that they respond to certain conditions, particularly warfare and mass death, and that attempting to engage with them militarily is ineffective at best and catastrophically counterproductive at worst." Webb opened his briefcase and removed a document, classified top secret, marked with security caveats that Ashworth had never seen before. The Ryukyuan people have coexisted with the Watchers for thousands of years. They developed protocols, rituals, methods of acknowledgement that maintained a balance. When we fought the Battle of Okinawa, we destroyed that balance. We violated sacred sites, disturbed burial grounds, and created conditions, mass death in confined spaces, that strengthened the Watchers beyond anything the indigenous population had ever experienced. You're saying that American military operations awakened something that should have remained dormant. I'm saying that warfare itself, particularly modern industrial warfare, creates conditions that thin the boundaries between what we consider the material world and what exists beyond it. Okinawa was not unique in this respect. Similar phenomena were reported at Verdun, at Passchendaele, at Stalingrad. But Okinawa was unique in the density of the phenomenon, the concentration of sacred sites in a small geographical area, and the cultural sophistication of the indigenous population's understanding of what they were dealing with. Webb leaned forward, his expression grave. "Your report cannot be published, Colonel. Not in any form. The families of the missing men will continue to believe their loved ones died in combat, and that is a tragedy. But it is a necessary tragedy. Because the alternative, acknowledging that we don't fully understand the nature of what we encountered, that there are forces in this world that exist beyond the reach of military force, would undermine public confidence in ways that could have strategic implications. You're asking me to participate in a cover-up. I'm asking you to recognize that some truths serve no purpose when revealed. The men who disappeared on Okinawa are gone. Nothing we document or acknowledge will bring them back. But what we can do is ensure that future operations don't repeat the same mistakes. We can ensure that sacred sites are respected, that cultural advisors are consulted, that commanders understand there are boundaries that should not be crossed." Ashworth thought about the 200 missing men, about the survivors who had been classified as psychologically damaged and dismissed, about Lieutenant Harker and Private Nakamura, and all the others who had encountered the Watchers and been forced to carry that knowledge alone. He thought about the official history he was supposed to write, a clean narrative of tactical challenges overcome through courage and sacrifice, with no mention of the things that happened in the caves. "What happens to my draft report?" "It will be classified and archived. It will remain available to those with appropriate clearances and legitimate need to know. But it will not be published, and you will not discuss its contents with anyone who lacks those clearances." Colonel Ashworth submitted his resignation from the Historical Division on the 15th of October, 1952. He would spend the rest of his military career in administrative positions, never again working on official histories. His draft report disappeared into classified archives, filed alongside hundreds of similar documents describing encounters with phenomena that transcended conventional military understanding. The official history of the Okinawa campaign, published in 1958, made no mention of the Watchers. It described the battle in terms of terrain, tactics, and the determined resistance of Japanese forces. It honored the dead, commemorated the sacrifice, and extracted lessons for future amphibious operations. It was accurate in every detail that could be measured and confirmed through material evidence. And it was fundamentally incomplete. The caves of Okinawa remain today. Many have been developed as tourist attractions, complete with paved walkways and electric lighting and placards describing their historical significance. Others remain sealed, too dangerous for civilian access or too contaminated with unexploded ordnance. And some, a small number, known only to those who maintain the old traditions, remain exactly as they were, guarded not by military sentries, but by local families who understand what their ancestors understood, that some places are thresholds, some boundaries must be respected, and some watchers must never be disturbed. The American military maintains its presence on Okinawa, tens of thousands of personnel stationed at bases across the island. They train in the hills and valleys where the battle was fought, unknowing that beneath their feet lie caves that their predecessors sealed for reasons that were never officially recorded. Occasionally, during exercises, soldiers report strange occurrences, equipment failures, navigation errors, the sensation of being watched by something that remains just beyond the range of visibility. These incidents are logged as training accidents or weather-related phenomena and quickly forgotten. But the old Okinawan families remember. They maintain the shrines, leave offerings of water and sake and rice at cave entrances that tourists never see, conduct ceremonies in the old language that fewer people speak with each passing generation. They teach their children to respect the sacred places, to avoid certain caves, especially on the anniversaries of the battle, to understand that the dead do not always rest and the watchers never sleep. Captain James Harker died in 1987 at the age of 64 of complications from emphysema. His death certificate listed the cause as natural, but his daughter reported that in his final days, he spoke constantly of Okinawa, of caves and mist and figures that watched from the darkness. He died in a hospital room in San Diego, 3,000 miles from the island where he had fought. But his last words, whispered to a nurse who did not understand their significance, were in Ryukyuan. "Majimun," he said, "the demons are here. They followed me home." Private First Class Nakamura never left a psychiatric facility. He died in 1963, still speaking in tongues, still conducting rituals with offerings of food and water, still trying to maintain a balance that had been broken 4 decades earlier in limestone caves on an island he would never see again. The Watchers remain. In the caves of Okinawa, in the limestone depths where offerings are still left by those who remember, in the boundaries between light and darkness where the dead keep their eternal vigil. They are patient. They are ancient. And they are waiting, as they have always waited, for the next war, the next disturbance, the next opportunity to remind the living that some forces transcend military power. Some boundaries should never be crossed, and some debts can never be fully paid. Following the reclassification review, mandated by the Freedom of Information Act, certain materials related to Operation Iceberg have been approved for limited release. Researchers seeking access to these materials should submit requests through appropriate channels. Be advised that some documentation remains classified due to ongoing operational security requirements related to current military activities in the Ryukyu Islands. Personnel assigned to duty stations in Okinawa are reminded that certain areas remain off-limits per standing orders dating to 1945. These restrictions are not merely administrative, but serve essential purposes related to force protection and cultural sensitivity. Violations will be subject to disciplinary action under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. For those who must enter restricted areas in the course of authorized duties, local cultural advisors are available through chaplain services. Consultation is not mandatory, but is strongly recommended. Some places remember, some boundaries should be respected, and some traditions exist for reasons that transcend official explanation.